So thank you very much for everyone, dear guests, esteemed colleagues and students. It's my distinct privilege to introduce our guest of honor for this year's annual lecture at the Department of Social Policy of the LSE. We are intrigued because we have the legendary Gosta Esping-Andersen in our midst, who also happens to be my PhD advisor, so that's given me double pleasure and privilege to introduce him this evening. To be honest, I must admit that Gosta Esping-Andersen doesn't need any introduction to social policy audiences. He is no stranger to any self-respecting social policy enthusiast, I think. But as much as he's practically a household name, I would still like to give a brief introduction of his credentials and his background for those very few people who may not know about his work. Gosta is one of the few global scholars, actually, whose work transcends disciplinary boundaries, and he is quite well regarded not only in the social policy group, as we are here, also in sociology, demography, and political science and economists. With that regard, he is one of the very elites of the social scientists and globally, so I'm super excited about it. Professor Esping-Andersen currently holds the position of Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Pompeu Fabra, and he is also a research professor at the University of Bocconi. And he is a distinguished member of American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is a distinguished member of British Academy, and he is also a member of scientific boards of numerous institutions. Just to name a few, he is a member of Danish National Institute of Social Research, Johan March Institute, IMDEA, and he has been previously awarded a Doctor Honoris Causa at Roskilde University and Copenhagen University. It's my pleasure to announce that he will be receiving in 2 weeks the Martin Crowley Prize for his contribution to sociology, exceptional achievements and contributions to the field of sociology at the European University Institute in Florence. Gosta's seminal contributions to comparative social policy and political economy are widely known and recognized in our department, and his groundbreaking book, 3 Worlds of Welfare Capitalism, and his subsequent work throughout the 1990s reshaped how we think and analyze and conceptualize welfare systems globally. So that's very well known by our students, but he has also contributed significantly in a major way to the study of social inequality and life course through numerous books and articles. In the last decade, Gosta has shifted his research focus to changing family dynamics, and he received a prestigious ERC Advanced Grant, out of which is 2 million euros, one of those advanced grants, out of which, in that project, produced numerous articles examining the transformation of partnering, fertility, divorce, and family dynamics. And tonight, I believe we will be hearing some of the research coming out of that grant project over the years. And finally, I think this is exactly the right audience to stress that, or to appreciate that, Gosta has also been actively engaged in policy work internationally. And our students are all aspiring for the applied policy work and policy making. Gosta has been involved in international organizations such as UN and the OECD, ISSA, and the European Union. He participated very famously in the preparation of the EU's Lisbon Summit in 2000, which was a big deal then, and co-authored a report on the welfare state reform for the Belgian presidency of the EU in 2002. And he has also been a member of the EU President Barroso's Social Policy Advisory Group. So he has been actively involving in the policy making of the things that he has been contributing as a researcher. So without further ado, let's give a roaring applause to our guest of honor, Gosta Esping-Andersen, and leave the floor to him.
Thank you, Berkay, for the kind words, and good evening to everybody here and everybody on the internet as well. We can't see you. I hope you can see us. I am not going to talk about the welfare state if anybody is expecting that. I'm not even going to mention the word social policy, except that one time I just did it. Now, I'm going to basically try to give a synthesis of where I am now, what the kind of research I've been doing here in the last couple of years, and what I'm continuing doing in the current epoch of my many, many years of work. It's about family. but it's about the dynamics and change of families across the post-war decades, and in particular across the last 2-3 decades, where the question is, where is the family going? I am going to give you what's called a multiple equilibrium kind of a framework to understand what is happening. But I'll get to that. Now, those of you who work on the family will be very familiar with two so-called theoretical frameworks to understand family life, family dynamics, family change. One is the second demographic transition thesis. Ronald Lescott is the chief spokesman for this perspective. And it's kind of a values-driven theory that is arguing that due to what they call postmodern values and norms that favor more and more individualism, less and less collectivism, less adherence to social groups, that results in the certain realizing your own identities. So it becomes more and more individualized, and as a result, the prediction is less family. Gary Becker, the economist, did not argue that the family is disappearing, but implicitly in his theory, it would be eroding to the extent that the role of, or the gender roles, would be changing in any radical way. And this is what I'm going to get to a lot this evening. So if there is an erosion of couple specialization, one partner takes care of the home, the other one earns an income. If that specialization disappears, or at least erodes significantly, there's no utility of partnering or getting married anymore. What would be the utility of that? What would be the point of it? The point of it is to have children and to specialize and reap the benefits of that specialization. And of course, also, if you have two earners, two careers in the couple, that would also raise the opportunity cost of having children. So fewer children, if any. That would be the prediction there. So this is the good old days when family was family, according to Hollywood. There is a couple of things that is very clear, that the lady or the woman is the one serving, and they have a couple of kids here, they also have a couple of kids here. So that was the family that we used to, that we knew in the past. And the postmodern version would be more like this. You don't see a lot of kids, if any at all. And the partnerships look like they're very fragile. Exactly like Lescot's kind of vision would predict. That is, it's sort of no strings attached, really, in the world of partnering. All right. If we look back in the decades up to, up to 2000, early 2000s, everything seemed to conspire in favor of that Lescott kind of vision of the erosion of the family. We had marriage rates dropping dramatically. We had fertility going down. We had divorce rates going up, more and more non-married couples via cohabitation. So it all looked like an affirmation of that postmodern world of the family. But, and one of the first buts has to do with fertility preferences as opposed to realized fertility. The fertility preferences have changed very, very little And it's only in a very few handful of countries where you have any kind of a significant drop in preferences for children. The two-child norm in terms of preferences remains solid. And this is even more interesting, in some countries, we're now seeing a reversal of that trend, everything going down, and we're beginning to see that on some dimensions, family is being resurrected. So, if that's true, then the second demographic transition or Beckett's prediction, they don't really work. We need another kind of theoretical framework to understand what's happening, what are the long-term dynamics of families, and where's the family heading? And that's what this is all about. So here's the preferences. I just put a couple of countries, UK is in there as well. And as you can see, cohorts born in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, with the exception of Germany, and if I put Austria in there, it would also be the case for Austria. With that exception, very stable preferences. Evidence number one. So these cohort data suggest stability in terms of what people want in terms of family, right? And also in terms of parity preferences. So that is, what is the optimal number of children? As you can see, the no-kid scenario is very minoritarian, or virtually nobody is in favor of that. One kid is also very minoritarian. It's all bundled towards the two-kid scenario. So the two-kid norm is still reigning, it's dominant. And even 3 kids is more than 0 and 1 added together. So this talk ought to sort of give a little bit of thought to these kind of data as well. But one thing that is to be added here, and that's why I have that but up there, is that preferences and actual intentions do not converge in the data, and they diverge increasingly. So this is preferences, but actual intentions of, that is, a number of kids that you intend to have, even if you already had one, what is the intention of having a second? Or if you're just starting, what is your intention of having 1, 2, 3? The intention data look less rosy from my point of view. So, my bid for an alternative theory puts women first. So, women are center stage in this story. Not necessarily heroes in that sense, but it's driven by the changing role of women. And here is my equilibrium. This is the way an economist would think about this. So we had, in the good old days where I had the photos I started with, we had the stable family with the two plus kids in the post-war era. It was a stable equilibrium in the sense that it reproduces itself over from one cohort to the next cohort to the next cohort. And each new cohort of youth entering into life of adulthood, they are already anticipating that this is the kind of family that they want and that they're going to have. That is, being married, specialized, she usually being a housewife, he being an earner, and they're going to have those couple of kids and a 2-car garage. B is where the equilibrium is beginning to erode. and it's eroding from several sides at once. But the one thing that's very important to underline here in equilibrium theory is that the decline of an old equilibrium that is stable and reproducing itself generation after generation, in order for it to erode, you need exogenous shocks. Otherwise, it won't erode as an equilibrium. What were those exogenous shocks? I think everybody here could answer that. The pill and the new role of women. Women entering into the labor force. And those two are obviously coincidental. So there was exogenous forces at work. And a third one that I think we should also mention is the household technology factor, which is also exogenous, that is hugely labor saving. In the old days, before the washing machine, it took about 2-3 hours to do a wash. Now it takes about 2 seconds, 2 minutes at the most. Labor saving frees the woman from the traditional household chores. And that is, of course, also a stimulus for women to enter into the labor force and start thinking of themselves as the pursuers of careers. So the family arose. But if there's no new kind of equilibrium emerging, what you have is what economists kind of erroneously call unstable equilibrium. A sociologist would call it kind of normlessness or confusion, normative confusion. And I think that's very much what we have been seeing here for decades. That is a confusion about family, about partnering. Are we really partnering for life? Or is it much more conditional? Are we really still adhering to that 2-child or 3-child norm? And do we really want that today? Especially if you're a woman and you also want a career and you want to do some serious lifetime devotion to the employment. So you start to have normative confusion. Point C would be where a new equilibrium is beginning to unfold. And the logic of equilibrium dynamics is that once it starts moving and getting going, it has its own natural accelerator. So it strengthens its own progress. And you get a steeper and steeper curve. And that's why I depict the kind of the long-term dynamics of family in terms of the U-shaped curve from trying, or at least the curve, trying to depict moving from one traditional equilibrium toward a potentially new equilibrium that I call C. And here's how written it all looks like. So in the old days, young males and women invested in the marital skills of the traditional family. Extraordinary shocks, the pill, household technologies. And where there are multiple equilibria, you have several what you call unstable equilibria. Buying norms of ideas, but none of them dominating. It's when some kind of a new norm begins to gain dominance, that's where the new equilibrium is going to emerge. Right? And I think it is all dependent on gender egalitarianism. Then the new gender roles are driving the show. Okay. So how can we identify this new gender egalitarian equilibrium? And is it emergent? Can we see it? Can we identify it in the data? Well, The first step would be to look at more gender equality in housework, within the four walls of the family unit. I have lived in Denmark, which I'm very unproud to say that Denmark started as a very gender unequal society in the 60s. So there's nothing innate about Scandinavia having much more gender egalitarianism than is the case in other countries. To the contrary. But then look, Denmark accelerates. Whereas Italy certainly doesn't. So you have some countries, and this is illustrated by 3. I could have doubled it up, but that then would just look a bit more messy. But basically, Sweden and Norway would look like Denmark. Spain would look more like Italy, and Austria and Holland would look more like Germany. Okay? So we're almost 50-50 in Denmark, or at least Danish men are, to be exact, they contribute, in my data, 43% on average. So that's almost symmetry. And that's, Italians hardly make it above 20%. We could also look at it this way, by education. And there it's very clear that highly educated tend to be more egalitarian. Highly educated men, sorry, tend to be more egalitarian. But it's not a big effect. Look what's really big. Bang. These are odds ratios. The importance of in a couple, the importance of a woman being a full-timer is much more decisive than if the male is beginning to embrace more gender egalitarian values. It's the role of women that are pushing everything here within couples. And it's when the typical woman is for life dedicated to full-time. And that is what has happened in the past 2-3 decades in the Scandinavian countries, but in a few other countries. The United States, a partial exception to that. Certainly not Britain, certainly not Germany, where the part-time, or the Netherlands, where the part-time norm of the woman, especially once she has her first child, becomes the norm. So that means that the push here towards a gender egalitarian distribution of housework is not very developed in countries where the woman's role is more of a part-time nature and not kind of convergent with the male full-time for life scenario. So I tried to, with some of my collaborators, some of my graduate students actually, we tried to count out with Denmark, Britain, Spain, countries really representing very different kinds of worlds, modernization if you want. Denmark sort of being the Boy Scout country, so gender equality, egalitarianism, Britain somewhere in between, and Spain being a laggard, right? So what is the proportion of the population of couples that adhere to that very traditional A type of arrangement? She's the housewife and he's the earner. Denmark, it disappeared. That 1% are women of luxury that spend their time shopping. It's almost disappeared. In Britain, it's still almost a third in Spain. Then, what is the proportion of couples that look like they are gender symmetric or gender kind of moving into the C of my curve, gender egalitarian type? Denmark is a little bit over 50%, but there's still a long ways to go to get to the 100. It's very modest in Britain. And I think that has to do with that part-time dominance of women once they have the first child. And Spain, nowhere even started. So here in the last column, I have data that show sort of the double shift. That is a gender asymmetric arrangement where the woman is employed, but at the same time, she also does basically all the housework. The vast majority of housework in China. The double. And as you can see, Denmark looks pretty good. Britain looks, together with Spain, not particularly fantastic in terms of kind of minimizing the double shift kind of arrangement among couples. Okay, back to the U-turn. Is it genuine? And is it really driven by gender egalitarianism or maybe something else? Well, look at the total fertility rate. This is a very basic statistic of fertility, but look at it. I mean, it happens differently for different countries. What I'm showing here is what it looked like in terms of the total fertility rate for these countries in 1960. And then the lowest point, and then now, which is during the last decade, okay? And what you see is that some countries start, look at you, look at the United States, look at Sweden, and look at Denmark. They are beginning to take that U form. Spain is not. Germany maybe beginning. Germany's beginning to get interesting. And it's going to be an interesting test case. That I'm going to, if I have time, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Now, the latest fertility data are showing something that we didn't expect. That is, in those countries that we saw that had the U, there's retrogression. They're going backwards. And we have seen, and it started before COVID, so it has nothing to do with COVID. But somewhere around 2015, around those years, you start seeing a marked drop in fertility in Scandinavia, Finland, very sharp, US also, and in many, many countries, including also the UK, by the way. That is puzzling. What is going on? Well, one thing is we have to do the demography in the right way. We have to tempo adjust our fertility rates. What does that mean? That means that we have to adjust them for changes in the age at which women on average have their child. And since women are postponing, we have to adjust for that. And when you adjust for that, the fertility rates look much more stable, around 1.8 to 2, which is just below reproductive population reproduction. But that sharp drop kind of disappears when we use tempo adjusted TFRs. That's also supported by birth order data. That is the number of kids that people are having. For example, there's having 2 children, having a second birth. That is quite stable. Okay. So, if there is some kind of drops in fertility, is there a second tempo transition? There was a first tempo transition led by the highly educated, that postponed and postponed first births. So highly educated women that especially were, of course, career-oriented and very strongly committed to the labor market, they were postponing and postponing. The average age of first child births are now about 30, 31 years of age in many, if not most, European countries. So there was this postponement. That's tempo adjustment, right? But that didn't happen very much among the low-educated women. What I think is hiding behind the drops in fertility right now in Scandinavia, North America, UK as well, has to do with a second tempo transition. The lower educated are beginning to postpone, but not for the reasons that the high educated women did. Not because the low educated are suddenly career crazy. It's mainly for different reasons. Namely, the increasingly unstable partner life among the very low educated. And a very large proportion of very low skilled males that women simply do not want to even partner with. So you have increasing instability of partnerships and family life among the low-skilled population. And I think that's what's feeding into the postponement. The low-skilled women are afraid of having children. They are hesitating, and they wait until something has started consolidating, and they know the partner better that they're together with. So the logic is very different, but we convergence possibly in terms of tempo behavior, that is timing of the first birth in particular. But this is speculative. We don't know. I mean, this is a hypothesis I'm just throwing out for discussion. So another indicator I use in terms of the transition toward the new equilibrium, or the movement from the old family model into a new family normative model, I use lifelong singlehood. And I use here women that are basically all their life. I looked at women up to the age of 50, 55, and looked at that they had no relationship with a male that lasted more than half a year throughout all those years. And what we saw was a reverse U. So that was very clear that is driven by the degree of gender equality in society. So in societies that are very traditional, you don't have a lot of lifelong single women got married. Then you had a growing proportion of women that never married or never even partnered in a stable way, as gender equality began to emerge, but didn't fully yet consolidate. Once it starts becoming very mature, that's where you then have a return to low rates of lifelong single. Another indicator. And here is crude divorce rates. These are actually bad statistics, but it's an illustrator. And what I did was just sort of rough and tumble sort of a list of countries that I think we all would agree are gender egalitarian. Norway, Sweden, US, okay, Denmark. Change in the crude divorce rate from 1985 to 2010, minus. And then we have gender traditional countries, Spain, Italy, Portugal, and Germany, until very, very recently, and you have no minuses. Here you have huge plus but that had to do with that divorce was prohibited during Salazar and Franco. And then suddenly the door to divorce opened up and the democratization process. So this is the Danish data, based on Danish registry data. So I had a huge sample of individuals, and I could estimate what are the odds of getting a divorce if the woman suddenly becomes the boss in the company. That is, she becomes the main earner. And I didn't just say that he had 51% and he had 49%. That is not really indicative of becoming a dominant, economically dominant. So I said that she had to earn at least 60. So she was pretty dominant. She had to do that for a minimum of 2 years in a row. So, in other words, the husband or the male partner would notice that she was now the dominant member. So, I took 2 cohorts of married cohorts, people married in 1980 and people married in 2000. And I looked at low educated, high educated in terms of what is the odds of getting a divorce. Here, almost 3 times if she became the main dominant earner. That is a big effect. 300% more. Bam. In the more recent cohort, where Denmark has become more gender egalitarian in its overall kind of value system, it's dropped significantly among the low educated. Disappeared completely among the high educated, which already started with odds ratios that weren't particularly high. In other words, it doesn't matter anymore for a Danish couple, if they're highly educated, whether she's the economic boss or he's the economic boss. It doesn't matter. And that's I think, a pretty strong indicator. So the question is, what does the scenario look like if it's the highly educated that are spearheading this new dynamic, the new return to family? They're becoming more and more stable, and that we know. And they are more likely to get married, that we can see in the data. And they are also more likely to have more children than the low educated. So the new return to family is very much driven by the higher educated. Is that producing polarization in society? So the lower educated are falling behind, and the distance in terms of family life and family well-being between the low educated and the high educated is widening and widening. Here's data from the US. And this is after 10 years of marriage, and the divorce rates for low educated and high educated. And as you can see, they're going in opposite directions. Polarization. The difference in more recent data is huge. Colossal. I mean, it's 30% percentage points gap. And the changing education gradient of divorce. Unfortunately, I couldn't go back to the same in Denmark, but this is the ratio of divorce probability of low educated over high educated. So, for example, Denmark in 1990s, 1.6. That means that Danish low educated are 60% more likely to get divorced than higher educated. And that increases. And that increases in all the countries that I have here. So, also a sign of family polarization. Divorce is more and more concentrated among the low educated. Now, you remember the lifelong singlehood graph I had before? That big inverse U. That big inverse U was almost totally dominated by the adults. And the adults are women of tertiary education. Lifelong singlehood was dominated by the highly educated. And this is also what, once you have more and more gender egalitarianism, it disappears. Another piece of good news from the point of view of the ramifications of gender egalitarianism for family and partnership life. And now here, and I'm almost done with my graphs and numbers. Now here, I took an indicator of gender egalitarianism, which I have been testing this with my collaborators over and over and over again. And the best of all the questions we have in survey data, this is social service data, is when jobs are scarce, men should have the first priority to have a job. That is a very gender traditional kind of item, right? So people who say yes to that are obviously very gender traditional, and the people who say no to that are egalitarian. So here goes the gender egalitarianism indicator on that axis, and the proportion that a divorce is separated by in the ages 40 to 60. And as you see, in 1980s, a very nice straight regression line. And well, there are a couple of countries falling a little bit outside, but it represents pretty well the linear. The more you have gender egalitarianism in the 1980s, the more you also had breakups, divorce, separations, and poor family relations. Look what has happened in a more recent data, in 2010 to 15, the latest. So the data we have is now turned into curvilinear relationship. So the highly egalitarian now have less probabilities of separation and divorce. So it's peaking, and here Austria, Spain, US, etc., are where they're halfway there. Is low in very traditional countries like Romania, and then it peaks today in the countries that have started on the process, the dynamics of more gender symmetry, but they haven't really taken the big step. And it's in countries like Denmark, Sweden, Iceland, where they are much more advanced in terms of gender egalitarian norms. This is where you have the decline of couple instability. And here's the final thing. These are, I'm back now to fertility. And again, I use the exact same gender equality measure as I used before. And here we look again at 1980 and then up to 2010, 15, all right? And there you had a curvilinear relationship. So countries that are very, very traditional, they had very high fertility. Fertility bottomed out where they were kind of wishy-washy in the middle, not really progressing, but starting towards gender equality. And then you had a couple of very few countries, Sweden, etc., where they had high degrees of gender equality and high rates also of fertility beginning to emerge. Look at how the curve moves to the right and upwards as time progresses. And as you go to the most recent, and here we see that it's no longer curvilinear. It's all been moved up. And now we have a very considerable amount of countries that are on the high equality, higher fertility side of the spectrum. And we have very few countries with the traditional kind of scenario. They more or less disappear everywhere. So if we kind of add up all this endless data that I've presented here, sort of cumulatively speaking, I think there's a pretty good case for the gender egalitarian driver of possibly that families are not going to necessarily disappear in the future, but that if gender egalitarianism really takes hold, we're also going to have a new kind of family. It's not going to look like it did in the golden era of the picture I started with. We're going to have much more cohabitation. We're going to have fewer children, but we're going to probably also have a strengthening of the ties of partnership and of family life, and possibly even a return towards the two-child scenario that we had. And then I just want to stop with this one. And this is a little bit of a warning to the male side of the group here. That is that it's very good news, because gender egalitarianism is the thrust, is there. Women are pushing it, and men are not capable of really stopping it. We can delay it maybe, but we cannot stop it. But maybe the gender egalitarian scenario is maybe not so good for men. And here is one possible result. Yes, pictures that one over there, not very inviting if you're a male. And I leave it with that. And thank you for being patient with me.
Yes, please take a seat. So I'll be sitting here. If you can allow me for a few minutes to take a bunch of questions online, and then I will apologize to online people to close the questions, and then I will turn to the room and then collect the questions from the room. I'll follow that order so that duplicate questions cannot come. We have a few questions online, Gosta. I will ask a couple of them together here. The first question comes from an anonymous attendee. They're asking about new forms of families. Do they include same-sex couples, more adoptions, and other diversity in the forms of families? What role do you envision for them? And there's also another question asking about, well, which is my addition and rephrasing a bit, were there other parts outside of Europe globally have been experiencing also declining in total fertility? Do you think that some of those theories that you talk about are also applicable to the global south? And then I will have two more questions. Do you want to answer them first?
Yeah, as to the first question, adoptions and gay couples, etc., the proportion in the data sets that we have are simply too small that we cannot estimate with it. It's not possible. I myself have adopted children, so I'm very sympathetic to the question, but we cannot estimate it with the data, with the kind of data we have. The second question was
global south on the rest of the world. Do you think that outside
yes.
Europe these are...
The country that is now the world leader in low fertility is Korea, South Korea. But also you look out in Southeast Asia and you see very sharply declining fertility just about everywhere. You see that also in Latin America now. Basically, it's a global phenomenon with the exception of Africa, so far. I think the logic, I'm not an expert on on Southeast Asian data, and but everything I can see and the studies that I have looked at that have focused, for example, on the Korean case, suggest that the logic is very, very similar, but more sharply defined in the sense that the gender roles are traditionally much more traditional compared to in Europe. Certainly in Korea and Taiwan, etc., in those Southeast Asian countries, gender roles continue to be very traditional compared to what is and has been the case in Western Europe in the last 3-4 decades.
So there's another question from Professor Tim Lyo from the US, and saying that thank you for sharing this beautiful theory, and given that in some societies gender egalitarianism may never be realized, or at least not anytime soon, how would you use your theory to explain that? And he also asks, how can we cite your theory?
Yeah. The US is actually a very interesting test case of the possible stagnation of the dynamics. And there are several. Paula England, an American demographer sociologist, has several articles where she argues about the stalled revolution. That is, that the gender transition in the United States has stalled, where there's something around 30% of the American population that continue to kind of slide into very traditional behavior, and that are not jumping on the bandwagon of gender egalitarianism and gender symmetric kind of behavior within it. And it is possible that it is not just an American phenomenon, that it may also happen in other countries, that the dynamics get stalled. But it's impossible to predict. I think there are a couple of reasons that would produce a stalled revolution. One is the absence of social policies, childcare policies in particular, and support for mothers who are employed. US is a dramatic example of the virtually non-existence of any of that, which is especially problematic for lower educated couples, simply because they cannot afford to go into the private sector. So the high educated in the US, they can go and purchase private childcare. The low educated can't. And I think that has a lot to do with it. That is, the social policy suddenly on that question becomes a central force of moving towards my gender egalitarian side of the curve. Without it, it is likely to get stalled. And here, since many of you are from the UK, you might also think about the UK. And it's a kind of country where also social policy-wise, there may be also an element of stagnation or stalling of the dynamics in a country like here. And here is where I'd like to go back to the German case. In the last 20 years, 15 years in particular, Germany has embarked on a very Scandinavian kind of huge, massive increase of childcare. They have reformed their parental leave systems to make it much more compatible with female careers. And it's changing the role of women in a very clear way in the last 15 years. And what we're seeing actually in not just West, but mainly in West Germany, is an increase in fertility. Whether it's also going to produce more couple stability and all the other positive elements that I have been discussing, we don't know yet. But it's to look out for it. if anybody is working in this area. Germany is a test case, and a very interesting test case.
Thank you so much, Gosta. Actually, this answers the last question came online that like Darlene Ney wanted to know a bit more about welfare state implications, what policies these trends would actually will inform. So you answered those questions nicely. So I want to apologize for the people online, and I'm not going to take more questions on the Zoom. I want to turn to the room and see whether there's any questions and hands. Mind there a number. Do we have microphones walking around? So should we start from you first and then go towards back?
Oh yeah. Hello. Yeah.
We can't hear you.
Oh yeah, hello. My name is Kun Lee, and I'm a PhD student in social policy at the University of Oxford. So, as a social policy student, it's so nice to hear your lecture. So I have a couple of questions, maybe a bit of questioning this theory and trajectory. So one is about Dutch case. So the Netherlands seems like a country with the B side in terms of gender egalitarianism, but showing the C level of fertility rate, has been showing pretty high level of fertility. So, and does that mean there may be another trajectory rather than the standard ABC trajectory? And also related question, also related to the US or other cases that showing stalled revolution. So is your theory suggesting like there will be the path for most societies following A to B to C, or is that are countries just being path dependent? B countries are just stuck in B for a long time, and C countries, because like you said social policy is playing a huge role and a welfare state is playing a huge role, but we know that welfare states are very much path dependent, and not many countries, maybe except for Germany, not many countries have achieved that Scandinavian level of generous family policy or social investment, whatever. So does that suggest that countries are stuck in B, so B countries are just stuck there for a long time? And another related question is that the difference between high and low educated men.
Sorry, high and low what?
High and low educated men. Is that, I mean, in terms of family formation, so is that about gender egalitarianism, or is that just the cost of family formation is too high that low educated people cannot afford in certain countries? So, yeah. I had too many questions, so sorry about that. Yeah.
Netherlands is kind of an interesting case. Netherlands scores quite high on the gender egalitarian values, but not in terms of gender egalitarian behavior. There's a big discrepancy in the Netherlands, and it's quite accentuated. One of them has to do with the women are locked into a part-time scenario. Very much. And that has to do with the absence of childcare. Childcare is built to cater to a part-time woman. Part-time in the Netherlands is mainly only a couple of days a week, or instead of half day. So Netherlands is 1 or 2 days working, and the rest of the week not. So the housewife side of the woman, the female coin, is still very dominant in the Netherlands, despite the values. And that reproduces itself, again, as you were also getting at, via the absence of social policies that would promote women to move into a more kind of full-time dedication for life, that is, career rather than pin money kind of dedication. Right. So that was your question about the Netherlands. The second one was, sorry, what was the...
High and low education difference, can it be because, like in terms of partner formation, family formation, can it be because of the cost of forming families rather than gender egalitarianism? It
could be both, actually, yes. And I would agree that it could be both. The gender egalitarianism is clearly there, but it may be narrowing more than the other side of that coin. Yes.
Great. Thank you. There are multiple hands. Should we get the microphone over there, lady on the back?
Hi, so it's a pleasure. I wanted to ask, because I'm obviously a big believer and follower of your theory on welfare states, but I'm a bit more skeptical about this.
Can you speak more into the microphone,
yes,
please?
better like this. I was just saying that I'm a bit follower and believer of your theory on welfare states, but I'm a bit more skeptical on this, because I have a question regarding if countries like Italy and Spain haven't even started this path to egalitarian equilibrium and haven't even done the EU turn, how do we know it's a natural trend and that they will get there eventually, rather than it being caused by different welfare regimes and different cultures and gender policies put into place? I mean, you were the one that theorized welfare regimes, and we've seen that Scandinavian regimes and welfare countries have done the U-turn, but how do we know Mediterranean regimes, for example, will follow the same U-turn? Wouldn't it be like much more useful if we analyze what drove those U-turns and we see if it can be applied to Mediterranean countries, and if it's desirable, then it is applied to know whether this U-turn will actually happen? I don't know. That was just a skeptical question.
So the question is, if I may rephrase, you just correct me if I'm doing something wrong. The question is, like for Mediterranean countries, for cultural and welfare state reasons, like, is it desirable for them to follow the same pathway as Scandinavian countries that they did in the U-turn? And is it more useful to study what actually drives the U-turns, different pathways, rather than theorizing?
Yeah, and not only if it's desirable that they go through that U-turn, how do we know it's going to happen if it's like completely different welfare regimes?
I mean, studying what's driving different dynamics across countries, and you do have distinctly different dynamics, and it doesn't fit perfectly with welfare state regimes, and so it fits to a large extent, but not perfectly. Belgium looks a bit more Scandinavian than continental Europe, and then you have that big divide inside Germany, where the East Germany is much more behind West Germany now in terms of adopting kind of the Scandinavian route of more and more gender egalitarianism, and it's unfolding quite rapidly in the Western side, right? So the fit between these kind of gender dimensions and welfare state regimes is not perfect, but I think is there, and it has to do not so much with the traditional dimensions of welfare regimes as with the very much more recent ones, in particular on the servicing side of the welfare state, in particular childcare services. That's the key here, and that's where things begin to go a little awry. I wanted to mention another example where the welfare state regime stuff doesn't fit perfectly, and that is Spain. Spain actually now has childcare coverage which is almost at 45 to 50%. So Spain is has been moving quite well. The quality of the system is poor, but coverage is quite extensive. So there's a country that doesn't fit at all with the Scandinavian welfare regime, but that's beginning at least to move in that direction of Belgium and Scandinavia in terms of childcare provision for what they are presuming to be predominantly full-time employed women across most of their lives. Is that an answer to your question? More or less. Less, more than more?
So, please, so can you, because we have a bunch of questions over there in the middle area, so if the microphone can stay there, that will be helpful. Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much for your lecture. It's really interesting. I was wondering, a lot of the data, while suggestive, seems largely descriptive or correlational. Was there a possibility of thinking of a more causal explanation or thinking about a natural experiment, for example, to think about whether or not, for example, this egalitarianism in gender relations is actually the cause for this?
I mean, you're perfectly right. I have no ambitions of causal explanation here whatsoever. I must also say that my presentation is a little bit sort of simplifying a lot of the work I've been doing. I didn't want to come up with endless sort of complex regression models and so forth and so on. I don't think that was sort of what was expected of me here. There are several reasons why it's almost impossible to work with causal modeling here. One is if we're analyzing cross-nationally, our sample of countries is too small for any decent causal estimation whatsoever. We could go into the microdata, and I showed several tables where I had worked on microdata. For example, the one about that she becomes the main earner in the couple and what are the divorce consequences of that. That's Danish registry data with a very large sample. And there we could have had causal ambitions if we had wanted to, but we didn't really want to do it, or I didn't want to push a causal explanation on something that is still evolving in terms of a theoretical framework.
Thank you.
Thank you for this question, because that was one of the questions that was on the chat, like in the last minute as well, so answers both. Great, thank you.
Yeah, I'm just gonna continue. Thank you for your presentation. The thing I was wondering is what role does life course play in your analysis or in your theory? Because I'm thinking of Bruno, for example, showing that with ongoing years of marriage, couples, even equal or couples who regard themselves as equal, kind of turn into more gendered roles, especially if children are introduced into the family or if the woman gets pregnant. So I was kind of thinking, how static are your ideas of gender inequality, and what role does life course play in your theory?
What role does life course play in this?
Yeah. It plays a big role, and I've tried to bring it out on various occasions in terms of various dimensions of this I've been working on. Life course data is hard to come by. There are only a handful of countries where we could even approximate something like a genuine life course type analysis of these kind of phenomena. You could do it with Danish registry data. You could do it with, if you coupled understanding society data from Britain together with the old BHPS data, you could do it. But the problem is that the old BHPS had a relatively modest sample size, and you run out of degrees of freedom pretty quickly when you start estimating this kind of stuff over the life course. So it's limited how much I've been able to do genuine life course analysis. Where I can, I've been doing it. That is trying to follow people as much as I can. And I did that, for example, again, to repeat my example there of the women becoming dominant That's kind of a life course. I was following them over 20 years.
Thank you.
But life course analysis usually amount to following people over 20, 30 years, and that's about it.
Yeah, hello. Thanks very much for the lecture. It was very interesting. I was one. Oh, hello. Oh, yeah. Thanks very much for the lecture. It was very interesting. My name is Lucas. I'm a master's student here. And I was wondering, you mentioned a couple of times that the fertility rates in Germany were very low, and that's an interesting test case. And I was just wondering if you can expand a little bit on the German case and why the fertility rates were so low. Thank you.
Germany is not a unique case in terms of very low fertility in Europe. It's just one country in the group of low fertility countries, which is also Italy, Germany, it's Austria, and there are several others. The country where I live, Spain as well, Portugal. So it's not a unique German case. Germany has had low fertility for a long period, but so has had Spain. So it's not a uniquely German phenomenon. But there are a couple of factors that are uniquely German. One has to do with the unification, and that East Germany and West Germany look very different on almost all the dimensions I've been working on here. So German average is a little bit disinformative, because it actually disguises, to a certain extent, a relatively internally, if not polarized, but quite bimodal kind of dynamics. And one of the things I think I mentioned it en passant, is that fertility is now beginning to recover in West Germany. In the last 15 or so years, we're seeing it going up. But that is not happening in East Germany, at least the data I've seen. So the two Germanys are moving in on different rails.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, question? Can we get the microphone over here? Yeah.
Thanks very much for the presentation.
We can't hear you.
Okay, thank you very much for the lecture. I have a quick question about the role of informal provisions.
The role of
informal welfare in achieving
welfare and informal.
Informal.
Yes. So most of the data which we are looking at
I think you need to.
So most of the data which we were looking at was related to the formal welfare provisions in achieving gender egalitarianism, as well as, and one of the important factors which is played in less divorce rates, especially when looking at global South countries, relates to the role of the extended family. When they come in, and in case of any conflict, they come in and they save the marriage. So in your theory, do you account for the role of informal welfare in achieving gender egalitarianism? And when we shift our lens from global South to global North, so how does the theory explain that factors over there?
That's an important question, and it's something that is very difficult to study, almost impossible. Is precisely because it's informal and not catalogued, not measured. In terms of informal care, probably the most interesting differences between Southern Europe and Northern Europe, where Southern Europe has a very huge reservoir of very low-paid immigrant women that do the child care, do the housework, and so forth and so on. So any middle-class family and above in Spain or in Italy would be able to afford an Albanian woman or immigrant from Turkey, wherever it may be. That is not the case in Denmark or in Sweden or in Norway, where they're priced out of the market. So the informal economy is undoubtedly very much bigger in terms of care servicing for care of the elderly or care of children and so forth and so on, much more in Southern Europe than in Northern Europe. But we really have no data, and for obvious reasons, because it's informal. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Fabio. I'm one of the fellows here at the Department of Social Policy. So I have two questions for you. My first question is whether you have looked at differences within countries. So for instance, one of the countries that you mentioned many times tonight is Italy. And obviously, if you look at the north, it's much more advanced in all sorts of ways than the south is, where also religion and the church still plays a role and shapes people's perceptions over whether they should have kids, when, and so on and so forth. And that leads me to my second question, which is countries like Spain and Italy, and I'm an example of that coming from Italy, have seen over the years, especially over the last few decades, so many people living, millions of people living. London, they say, they've calculated that because of how many Italians live in the city, it could be the 5th biggest city in Italy if it was an Italian city. So my question is, isn't it perhaps the fact that these countries show that they haven't made much progress, isn't it in part at least because those who could make that progress have left?
Yes, I haven't done really much on intra-national, regional, or whatever differences. I've looked a little bit in the case of Italy that you mentioned, and there it's much more messy than the North-South divide. For example, the higher rates of fertility are found, for example, in the Bologna type area, Emilia-Romagna, but very low in Veneto. And Veneto looks, from a demographic point of view, more like the Mezzogiorno, that is the Southern Europe, Southern Italy. So Italy is a patchwork rather than North-South divide. Okay, the North-South divide is visible, but then that one is accompanied by intra-North-South, North and intra-South differentials that are quite significant.
Thank you.
I think you had also a question about Spain that I think I...
People leaving.
Ah, yes. Okay.
Yeah. Fiona. So.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Does it work? Okay. I'm Fiona. I'm also a fellow in the department. So my question is about whether some countries that do have a large proportion of women working full-time, so they have the double earner model, might they transition more into the double shift equilibrium rather than the scenario you presented, which I found very optimistic, but yeah.
What's important is not just double earner full-time, but for life. That is, the woman sees herself as being basically masculinizing the female life course, right? And the question then, turning it on your head, is, are we also seeing a feminization of the male life course? We're seeing it in some countries. I didn't really talk that much about Denmark, which is my country of origin, but if I can make a big spiel out of my fantastic origins, 30% of Danish men, in the latest data I worked on in terms of time use, 30% of Danish men make more than 50% of housework. That's impressive, I would say. But that, I think you can probably also find something similar in Sweden. But that's about it. You're not going to find that in the United States, that's for sure.
Thank you. Margaret.
Hi, thank you very much for this presentation. It was really interesting. I also apologize because I also have two questions, but the first one's quick. So for the gender equality measure, you used the question of when jobs are scarce, and you mentioned at some point that you used many measures, and a lot of questions today related to children and childcare. Have you tried with the, so this question is probably from the World Value Survey. There is another one in this survey about when a woman works, children suffer, and I would expect your model to work even better with this question. So wonder if you've tried with this and how the data reflected your theory with this one. And the second one was thinking about the D after the C and the next exogenous shock. And from public debates, I don't know about scholar work, I see two trends happening. The first one is climate change and the fact that people don't want to have children anymore because they're afraid of what's going to happen next. And the second one is fertility crisis. The fact, and I don't have the medical data, but that more and more couples suffer from the fact that they can't have children. Have you thought about those future events in your model and how they can affect the D trend, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, those are questions that are very difficult to answer because they're about the future. And I'm not a seer, and I don't even have binoculars, so I'm myopic on that count. Is there anything to be said for the argument that we may see return to younger ages of childbirth? I don't think so. I don't think we're going to see among higher educated. I think we've reached sort of the plateau, and the tempo effect is not going to continue to unfold among the higher educated. I don't believe that because we're already at age 30 for the first, or 31 even now in some countries for the first child. In Spain it's 31 now. That's European leader. I think it's world leader. And as I said, I think, at least that's what I'm hypothesizing, that lower educated women are now following step on this. And they may be moving up also towards that 30, age 28, 30, 29, 30. You see it in the United States. There you do see a steady increase in the age of first childbirth. But what we're also seeing, and I think what's going to be much more important, is the spacing of birth. To the extent that people want that second child, and I think my data suggests that the majority want the two kids if they can have it, and if it combines with everything else, okay, the spacing from the first to the second is going to be shorter and shorter. And that's where Scandinavia is a vanguard again. And Sweden actually introduced policies to support that very tight spacing of between the first and the second and possibly the third child. And it resulted in the effects that the reforms were driving at.
Thank you, Gosta. So we're going to get two quick questions, and with that we wrap up. So there's one question on the back, and I'm sorry I have to give the word over here. So, and the second question, can you,
Hi, thank you for the talk. I have a lot of questions about it, but I'll limit myself to one, as you suggested. You mentioned that, well, you think that we all agree that the United States would be a gender egalitarian country. And you also were talking a lot about fertility as a measure to use. And I was wondering if you really think that in a country that limits access to abortion, we could talk about a gender egalitarian country, because I would disagree.
So can we pass the microphone to the second question, please, and then we get them back to back.
What was that question? I didn't catch it.
A country that bans abortion, can we call them as a gender egalitarian country?
country. Yeah, please.
Thank you. My name is Audrey, and I'm an undergraduate student studying social policy at LSE. So I have two questions. The first one is, nowadays, as we can see, that women with higher educational background tend to have higher divorce rate. Do you think this is a good thing or a bad thing, like to the individual women as well as to the society? Is this a positive symbol as women nowadays are more capable of escaping a marriage that they don't want, or a negative symbol as people tend to be less committed to a relationship, which may increase social instability? And the second question is, as what you said, the dual breadwinner model accelerates gender egalitarianism, which refers to equal earnings. Then what else can or should be equally shared between men and women to achieve gender equality? Is treating women in the same way as men a feasible solution to achieve gender equality at the end of the day? Thank you.
I got lost there.
So the second question, we may need to cut it off because we had quota for only 2 questions. So the first question was whether increasing divorce is a good thing for individual women, or
and the society,
or a bad thing for individual women or the society. Increased rate of divorce is, for women who are in the higher education group.
Well, what we're seeing is that highly educated women's divorce rates are falling, and they're falling very clearly, especially in countries where gender role change has gone quite far. So Northern Europe, Scandinavia, etc., that's where you see it strongest. So that's where you have more and more couple stability among the high educated. Vice versa among the low educated. There you have more instability. And that has a lot to do with the increasingly problematic economic and social position of unskilled males, that they are not wanted. And they're doing very poorly economics-wise, income-wise, and partnering-wise. And that's where you have that big differential between the high and the low skilled that has been unfolding here in the last decades. And in some countries, it's much more dramatic than in others. And that's in particular in countries like the US, whereas it's less the case in Scandinavia, because now virtually all couples in Scandinavia are dual earner couples. In fact, the income situation now in Scandinavia is such that a one-earner couple would probably have difficulty surviving unless they were extremely highly paid. You need 2 incomes for the typical middle-class couple. 2 careers, 2 incomes, and otherwise you're not going to be able to pay your mortgage, food, the car, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So the last question was about the country where the abortion bans are in place. Can we call them still gender egalitarian or not? And now with that question we finish. So.
Yeah, where there's abortion bans, they tend to be very gender traditional. And you can also see it in the United States, where some states now are beginning to ban abortions more and more, extremely the case. And they tend to be also the states that, in terms of gender relations, are the most conservative and traditional. So there's a clear relationship there. That is very clear.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much, everyone, for the questions. And
thanks, Tim.
Thank you so much.